If you've ever visited or indeed lived in the US, you would have probably come across the Ford Explorer, not only because it's been around since the 1990s, but also because it was America's best-selling SUV. Step forward the new fully electric Explorer, which has actually been built in partnership with Volkswagen. This is because the two manufacturers have got a partnership, and this is effectively an ID.4 under the skin. Now, at the time of filming and in the UK, it's available in 3 different trims. The Style, the Select and the Premium, which there you'll also find 3 different powertrains and battery packs. A 52, a 77 and a 79 kilowatt-hour battery pack, with the latter also being an all-wheel drive vehicle. Prices range from roughly £40,000 and go up to £54,000 without adding any additional options. Although right now it's also available with a £4,000 saving, making it actually quite tempting. Speaking of which, if you do want to find some of the best deals for this vehicle, make sure you check out the links down in the description below or the pinned comments, or by scanning the QR code that can be found on your screen. Now, in this review, which will be covered in such a format, we'll see if it's actually worth its price tag and of course how it compares to some of its competitors, including its sibling, the ID.4. So yes, indeed, you've got quite a few different battery packs to choose from. First off, you've got the 52 kilowatt-hour model, which will give you roughly 220 to 230 miles, at least on the WLTP mixed driving cycle. Then you've got the 77 kilowatt-hour model, which takes things up a notch to give you roughly 340 to 370 miles, while the 79 kilowatt-hour model gives you 329 miles. Now here it is also worth considering that all the vehicles do not come with a heat pump included as standard, and should you want that you'll have to splash out an additional £1,050, which I do think is pretty ridiculous. Specifically in the modern era, a lot of the alternatives out there do indeed offer a heat pump, and in this respect this is the same sort of complaints that could have been said of the Volkswagen vehicles. Now, in case you're wondering why a heat pump is important, well, if you live in a colder climate, for example, for those of us in the UK, it adds to the overall efficiency while heating up the cabin, because it takes heat that's dissipated from the vehicle electronics and feeds it into the cabin in a safe manner. Without that, then you're effectively having to use a bit more electricity, and therefore that can eat away of your electric range. Now, the vehicle that is on review is the all-wheel drive Premium with a heat pump included, therefore the 79 kilowatt-hour model with the 329-mile WLTP claim. Now, from my own mixed driving test, I netted 260 to 280 miles, which is actually pretty impressive. I would have expected a little less range if I didn't have the heat pump included within this press car, and equally in terms of the 77 kilowatt-hour model, which will be the range-topping variant, I would have expected north of 300 miles. As for the entry-level model, I would have expected roughly 160 to 180 miles. Now, as you'll be able to see from the mileage leaderboards, that's actually pretty decent, and for the vast majority of consumers, the overall electric range that even the all-wheel drive model provides is actually pretty impressive, and therefore means that you won't get that much range anxiety. Of course, there are some other vehicles out there that will provide you even better range, but in my opinion, I do think here Ford, or indeed Volkswagen, have done a good job with their battery packs. Now, in order to maximise on efficiency, specifically when you're pottering in and around town, you'll want to enable regenerative braking. And here this can be done by flicking up on the gear selector and going on the B mode, which I am currently in. Driving at 30 miles an hour, if I were to lift off the accelerator pedal, the vehicle will start decelerating, although it will continue rolling and not come to a complete standstill, which in my opinion is a slight missed trick, because there are certain other alternatives out there that provide you a full one-pedal drive. And why am I pointing this out? Well, simply when you're just pottering around town, driving with a singular pedal just makes it a little less cumbersome rather than having to resort to the physical brake pedal. Same complaints again that could have been said of any Volkswagen vehicle, or pretty much almost all the Volkswagen vehicles, because some of the modern ones do actually provide you a one-pedal drive. Now, nonetheless, if you do not like that feel and you want to be coasting, for example, when you're on the motorway, then you can simply slip to D mode, which is drive, and therefore if I were just to lift off from 30 miles an hour, the vehicle will continue rolling. So aside from recouping energy while on the move, you can of course plug it in. And here via CCS ports, you can achieve between 135, 145 and 185 kilowatts of input, depending on the trim level chosen and therefore the battery pack configuration. As such, if you do find a high-speed charger on the motorway, you can go from 10 to 80% in roughly 25 to 28 minutes. All vehicles come with an 11 kilowatt onboard charger, allowing you to replenish its battery pack from 0 to 100% in around 6 to 12 hours. Of course, this will take longer if you've got a 7 kilowatt wall box or a regular 3-pin input. So aside from all of this, let's talk about driving comfort. And in comparison to its sibling, the ID.4, it does feel a little bit stiffer. The same sort of comments were said when I reviewed the Ford Capri, and comparing and contrasting it with the likes of the VW ID.5, it indeed also felt a little bit harder. When it came to pottering in and around town, I was able to feel some of the anomalies, the speed bumps and the potholes a little bit more within the cabin. And sometimes when treated with larger speed bumps or slightly larger potholes, I did find that the rebound was a little bit aggressive. That's not too bad in the grander scheme of things, and it's somewhat on par with the likes of the Tesla Model Y and the MG5 EV, but in comparison to some other vehicles out there which have got an adaptive air suspension or a bit more of a sophisticated suspension configuration, it can't quite compete. In terms of the overall driving dynamics, it does actually feel pretty well planted on the ground, specifically the all-wheel drive model, giving me fantastic traction when going around winding country routes. I had no issues whatsoever when it came to laying down the power, and also when it came to decelerating the vehicle, the brakes felt actually pretty good. Sometimes they can feel a little bit grippy when you have the auto hold function and you're pottering in and around town, but in the grand scheme of things, I do still think that Ford have done a good job in this department. In terms of the overall input that you're getting with the front axle, do make no mistake that it's not going to compete with sportier SUVs, but in comparison to the Volkswagen alternatives, the Ford Explorer does actually feel a little bit more connected. Now, due to its slightly stiffened suspension configuration, it does mean that the vehicle doesn't suffer from as much body lean when it comes to going around winding country routes, at least in comparison to the Volkswagen alternative. Although make no mistake over here, you don't really have a fantastic one-to-one connection with the front axle, even on the all-wheel drive vehicle. It just feels a little bit disjointed, especially if you compare and contrast it with some of the alternatives out there on the market. Still, I do think that the vehicle was pretty pleasurable to drive, and here when it came to laying down the power, especially in the all-wheel drive vehicle, I had absolutely no issues whatsoever when it came to traction, therefore inciting even better confidence. Speaking of which, over here, the braking performance was actually pretty good. When it came to putting my foot down on the brake pedal in an emergency situation, it didn't feel too hollow, and therefore gave me good sort of braking performance, therefore giving me a little bit of extra confidence when it came to going around winding country routes at speed, or of course if I ever had to use it in an emergency situation. Now this does bring me on to performance. And here you've got the 52 kilowatt hour model with a rear wheel drive configuration, dispatching 125 kilowatts of power or 168 horsepower and 310 newton meters of torque. It's claimed to go from 0 to 62 miles an hour in 8.7 seconds. Now should you want some extra power, you might want to go for the 77 kilowatt hour model, which also operates on a rear wheel drive configuration, giving you 210 kilowatts of power or 282 horsepower and 545 newton meters of torque. It goes from 0 to 62 miles an hour in 6.4 seconds. As for the all-wheel drive vehicle with its 79 kilowatt hour battery pack, it dispatches 250 kilowatts of power or 335 horsepower and 679 newton meters of torque. Again, it's claimed to go from 0 to 62 miles an hour in 5.3 seconds. Now, using RaceLogic's Performance Box Touch, I tested the all-wheel drive model from 0 to 20 miles an hour in 1.4 seconds, 0 to 30 miles an hour in 2.1 seconds, 0 to 60 miles an hour in 5.07 seconds, so pretty much bang on the manufacturer's claim, and 50 to 70 miles an hour in 2.6 seconds. I also clocked in a peak acceleration of 0.67 G. Indeed, if you do put your foot down on the accelerator pedal, namely in the all-wheel drive vehicle, it really does send you flying. As for its top speed, it's limited between 99 and 112 miles an hour, depending on the chosen trim level. So next up we get onto its interior design, and here it doesn't really stand out over some of its modern rivals, and in fact it's very similar to the Volkswagen ID.4 in that it does look decent. However, when it comes to the use of materials, there are certain cost cutting that can be found towards the dashboard, the door trims and the center console. Here you'll find some harsh plastic. Furthermore, it's actually pretty disappointing that you do not have physical buttons and dials on the steering wheel, and instead you have got these haptic and touch sensitive buttons instead. Not only are they a little bit cumbersome to use while you're on the move, but they can sometimes be accidentally initiated if you're going to be cornering at speed. In fact, here you'll also find a lack of physical buttons, for example, for your rear windows, and indeed over here you'll have to use a shortcut that's found for the front windows. It just seems to be a little bit on an unnecessary cost cutting that's been done by Volkswagen and indeed adopted by Ford. Now, when it comes to your climate controls, they're actually all done via the center portrait 14.6-inch display. The display itself is very vivid and intuitively laid out. You've also got a permanent bar towards the bottom for those climate controls, so therefore it does actually become very easy to use. However, I did notice that certain instances when it came to interacting with the screen were a little bit laggy, be it in terms of going between certain apps or, for example, pinching and zooming. Here I did find that the vehicle was not quite as responsive as some of its rivals. I also found that at times Android Auto and Apple CarPlay would not properly connect, and indeed would leave me pretty frustrated, and the only way to get around this was to actually just turn off the car altogether, give it a while, and then come back and then reinitiate the connection. Now, yes, indeed, Android Auto and Apple CarPlay are supported over a wired and wireless connection. And it's also good to see that turn-based navigation data from these third-party mobile operating systems feed through to the fully digitalized 5.3-inch instrument cluster, which is somewhat customizable. Now, as an extension to this, you have got a head-up display, although this can only be found as part of the driver assistance pack, which will set you back a whopping £1,300 to £2,200, depending on the chosen trim level. I really wish that this was actually a separate option, because it does add to the overall safety credentials, because it keeps your eyes planted on the road by providing you the traversing speed and the safety systems that are in operation. Now, nonetheless, when it comes to its audio system, you do have a little bit of an option, and this is depending on the trim level you go for. In the Style and Select, you've got a 7-speaker setup, which will suffice for basic music listening. If, however, you're a bit more of a music lover or a budding audiophile, then you might want to consider the premium trim, because this brings in a 480-watt Bang & Olufsen system with 10 speakers. This actually does well across the sound frequency range, although isn't to be mistaken for a top-tier audio system in comparison to some of the alternatives out there on the market. In fact, if you want a detailed breakdown of the audio system that's found within the Ford Explorer, make sure you check out my detailed audio review that can be found up on your pop-up banner, or by following the links down in the description below or the pinned comments. So next up we get onto storage, and here it's disappointing that the glove box has not been optimized for right-hand drive vehicles. A little bit of laziness from Volkswagen, and equally disappointing from Ford. Nonetheless, you still have got plenty of storage areas within the cabin. First off, towards the center console and at the top, you have got a movable 14.6-inch display. Not only is this useful in order for you to have a bit more of a clean dashboard design, or indeed make it a little bit easier to see your navigation system, or of course the infotainment system, but it also does reveal a small little area, handy for example for placing a smartphone or some loose change. It's also good to see that you have got some non-slip material. Further down you'll also find 2 USB Type-C ports, which are used to provide charge and also connect up to the infotainment system. Further down, you have got 2 angled areas, which are handy for placing larger size smartphone. And here it will actually double up as a wireless phone charger in the Select and Premium trims. Then further down, you've got 2 cup holders, and then you've also got a pretty large area that's found within the center armrest. In fact, here you can even remove the cup holders in order to reveal extra storage, which is really nice optimization from the manufacturer. Underneath the center console, you've also got a large open area, handy for example for a small to medium sized purse or a very small rucksack. As for the door bins, the front 2 are large enough to accommodate a 500ml bottle alongside some small to medium sized valuables, although it's disappointing over here that they have not been lined in any sort of fabric or non-slip material, and therefore means that you can hear a little bit of rattle, especially if you've got any sort of reusable metal bottles. And as for the rear, it's unsurprisingly that they're a little bit more limited. However, they're still actually pretty big considering some of the alternatives out there. Extra storage can be found by pulling down the armrest compartment, and here you'll find 2 cup holders. Elsewhere, you've got 2 USB Type-C ports at the rear portion of the center console, which are used to provide charge for your rear occupants. Now, of course, when it comes to storage, we have to talk about its boot capacity. And here it depends in terms of which trim level you go for, because if you go for the top spec premium, you'll have the subwoofer in the boot, therefore taking up 5 litres of capacity. Here you have got 465 to 470 litres with the seats in place, and 1,455 to 1,460 litres if you drop them down. Indeed, it is actually pretty large and therefore makes it very practical for larger size families. It's also good to see that you have got a hatchback design that opens up pretty wide, and it's manually operated, although this does become electronically operated with a hands-free function in the premium trim. This can be added in the other trim levels for £1,800 to £2,200 because it comes comprised within the driver assistance pack. Now the boot itself is also very practical because you have got a flat loading bay when you drop down the seats. You've got 60-40 rear split folding seats and also a underfloor compartment. Although it's worth noting over here that you do not have a frunk, in other words, an area at the front of the vehicle for additional storage like some of its competitors provide, which I do think is a slight missed trick. Nonetheless, with the amount of storage you've got within the boot, it should suffice for the vast majority of consumers. Furthermore, I would also like to highlight that you have got 75 kilograms of roof load capacity, and also in terms of towing, it's rated at 750 kilograms for unbrake trailers and between 1,000 to 1,200 for brake trailers, which is certainly pretty impressive. So aside from transporting goods, what about when it comes to the seats? Well, here all of them are very accommodating and soft, and I had no issues whatsoever, even in terms of longer drives. The front 2 seats are manually operated in the style trim with 6-way controls, although this does move over to 12-way power controls with a memory and massage function in the select and premium trims. In these models, you'll also find heated front seats and similarly a heated steering wheel. Now, should you want these features in the entry-level style trim, you'll have to splash out an additional £900 on the comfort pack. Well, I do think it's actually pretty affordable considering what you're getting. Although some will actually argue to say that these features should come as standard across the entire trim range, and I also agree with you. Now, apart from that, in terms of the amount of headroom and legroom, it's actually pretty good, not only at the front but also at the back. As someone who's just under 6 foot, I had no issues whatsoever in both departments. It's also good to see that the manufacturer has optimized the rear footwell design by keeping it completely flat, and as a result means that you can even have 3 full-size adults who are sat at the back without any sort of discomfort. Now elsewhere, I would like to highlight that the panoramic roof, which is pictured, does come included within the premium trim only, and there's no means of actually adding it in, at least as far as I'm aware, and in the UK, in the style and select trims. Now this does bring me onto its exterior design, and here I don't think it looks anything like the original Explorer that came out in the 90s, or even the modern alternatives that can now be found in the US. Still, it does look the part. At the front, you have got a nice headlight design that wraps towards the side of the vehicle, therefore giving it a good sort of stance on the road. And of course, you have got a covered front grille, just due to the fact that it is a fully electric vehicle. Then towards the side, you have got a relatively nice silhouette, and even with the 19 or 20-inch alloys that come fitted as standard, it looks pretty good. Although here, this vehicle was actually fitted with the optional 21-inch alloys that are only available within the premium trim for an additional £1,000. As for the rear, it very much does look like a Ford because of the integrated spoiler and also the taillight design. Frankly, when it comes to its exterior, I've got no complaints whatsoever, although certain people will of course argue to say that it very much doesn't look like the original Explorer. Now, apart from that, in terms of the colour finishes, it comes as standard in white. If, however, you want one of the other metallic finishes, such as the blue one that is pictured, it'll cost you an additional £800. So moving on from its exterior design, this brings me on to safety. And here it was tested by Euro NCAP and awarded a full 5 out of 5 stars, scoring 89% in adult occupancy, 86% in child occupancy, and 72% in its safety assist scores. Now, it's great to see that you've got a plethora of driver assistance systems that come featured as standard, such as intelligent adaptive cruise control with stop-and-go technology, which does actually work a treat by keeping you at a safe distance from the leading vehicle without feeling jerky either. You then also have got lane keeping aid with lane departure warning, traffic sign recognition, evasive steering assist, pre-collision assist, and cross-traffic alert with active braking and exit warning. Now, should you want to up the ante, you might want to go for the driver assistance pack, which will add lane centering and lane change assist. This will set you back between £1,300, £1,800 or £2,200, depending on the trim level chosen. I do think it's actually a worthwhile inclusion because it takes away the stress from those mundane motorway trips. Now, it's worth highlighting over here that very much like a lot of other modern vehicles, that the safety systems will become re-enabled every single time you power on the vehicle, including even if you were just to power it off, everything will become re-enabled. Now, as a result, should you want to disable some of these systems, you might want to set a vehicle favorite, and this can be done by tapping the car icon on the infotainment screen and having driver assistance. Or alternatively, you can press the blue icon, which is the driver assistance menu, and disable some of these systems. It is a shame, however, that there is no shortcut, as far as I'm aware, that can be found on the steering wheel or the stalks, which would have just added to the overall convenience while driving the vehicle, and therefore not having to faff around with the infotainment system should you have actually forgotten them and actually wanted to have them disabled. Now, aside from this, I would like to point out that visibility at the front, side and rear are all pretty good. Of course, rear visibility can be a little bit limited, specifically if you have got some occupants. But thankfully, you have got a rear wiper, a rear camera and front and rear parking sensors that come fitted as standard. Should you want to have some extra security when it comes to parking the vehicle, for example, preventing you from curbing the rims, then you might want to go for the driver assistance pack, which again costs between £1,300, £1,800 or £2,200, because this will bring in 360-degree cameras with active park assists. So with all that in mind, it brings us on to a verdict of the new Ford Explorer. And sure enough, there are certain things that could have been improved across the board, be it in terms of the overall driving comfort, the technology that's been used within the cabin, or of course the fact that Ford could have actually relied on using their own platform rather than actually going and partnering up with Volkswagen. But if you do look past that, you've actually got quite a complete vehicle, and one that was actually pretty impressive when I reviewed the ID.4 quite a few years ago. It's got fantastic electric range, it's pretty good to drive, you have got good set of driver assistance systems and good amount of legroom and headroom for your rear occupants and a good amount of boot capacity. Right now, it's also very competitively priced with its sibling, the ID.4, and in fact, if you take the £4,000 saving into account, or of course if you can find a good deal on it, then this will actually make it a no-brainer for families. And as a result of this, it actually gets our Best Buy award. Now, I'd be curious to know what you make of it down in the comments section below, and if you'd pick it over some rival SUVs. If you've enjoyed this detailed independent review, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing and hitting that bell notification, all of which would be greatly appreciated. As such, I've been Chris from TotallyEV, and I hopefully see you next one. Take care of yourselves, and goodbye.